Matt Damon walked in quietly, sat in the back row, just another face in the crowd. But when he asked a simple question, the professor didn't miss the chance to humiliate him, laughing, right in front of everyone. What no one expected was the answer Matt Damon was about to give, and how it would leave the entire room in stunned silence, chills running down their spines. To continue listening to this incredible and inspiring story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Write your name and the city you're watching from in the comments so I can include a special shout out for you in an upcoming story. The autumn leaves danced gracefully outside the towering windows of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, their golden hues painting a picturesque backdrop against the red brick buildings that had witnessed decades of scientific breakthroughs. Inside Building 18, the chemistry department buzzed with its usual morning energy. Students clutched their steaming coffee cups like lifelines, their backpacks heavy with textbooks that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Professor Richard Hawthorne adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses as he prepared for his advanced organic chemistry lecture. At 55, he had spent over 2 decades at MIT, building a reputation that was as formidable as it was intimidating. His office walls were lined with awards, published papers, and photographs of him shaking hands with Nobel laureates. To his students, he was a legend. To his colleagues, he was a force to be reckoned with. To himself, he was nothing short of brilliant. The lecture hall gradually filled with eager faces, each student representing the cream of the crop from universities around the world. These weren't just any chemistry students. They were the future researchers, the innovators, the minds that would potentially reshape the scientific landscape. The atmosphere was thick with ambition, and the faint smell of sanitized laboratory equipment. As Professor Hawthorne arranged his notes, his eyes scanned the room with the practiced gaze of someone who had delivered this lecture countless times. He knew most of these faces by now, the overachievers who sat in the front row, the quiet geniuses who preferred the middle seats, and the occasional struggling student who tried to hide in the back. But today, something was different. In the very last row, partially obscured by the shadows cast by the overhead lights, sat a man who seemed oddly out of place. He was dressed simply in a navy moon sweater and jeans, his hair slightly tousled, as if he had just walked in from the crisp Boston morning. There was something familiar about his profile, but Professor Hawthorne couldn't quite place it. The man was scribbling notes in a worn leather journal, his posture suggesting both humility and intense concentration. Several students had already noticed the unusual presence. Whispers began to ripple through the classroom like a gentle wave, heads turning discreetly to catch glimpses of the mysterious figure. Some pulled out their phones, squinting at their screens as if trying to confirm a suspicion. The energy in the room shifted subtly, curiosity mixing with the usual pre-lecture anticipation. Professor Hawthorne cleared his throat, commanding immediate attention. His voice boomed across the lecture hall, with the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. Good morning, class. Today we'll be diving deep into the complexities of stereochemistry and its applications in pharmaceutical synthesis. I trust you've all completed the assigned readings from Clayton's textbook, though I suspect some of you may have found the concepts to their expectations. The students straightened in their seats, notebooks open, pens poised. This was going to be one of those lectures where every word mattered, where falling behind meant struggling to catch up for weeks. The mysterious figure in the back row looked up from his journal, his eyes meeting the professor's gaze for just a brief moment before returning to his notes. As Professor Hawthorne launched into his lecture, his passion for chemistry became evident despite his intimidating demeanor. He moved with practiced precision between the whiteboard and his podium, drawing complex molecular structures with the fluid motion of an artist creating a masterpiece. His explanations were detailed, thorough, and undeniably brilliant, covering topics that would make even graduate students pause to catch their breath. The beauty of organic chemistry, he declared, his voice carrying a hint of theatrical flair, lies not just in understanding individual reactions, but in seeing the elegant dance of electrons, the subtle interplay of orbital hybridization, and the precise choreography of stereochemical transformations. The students scribbled furiously, trying to keep pace with both his words and his increasingly complex diagrams. Some nodded in understanding, while others wore expressions of barely concealed confusion. The man in the back row, however, seemed to be absorbing every word with quiet intensity, occasionally making notes that appeared more thoughtful than frantic. 20 minutes into the lecture, Professor Hawthorne paused to survey his audience. His eyes swept across the room, gauging comprehension levels with the practiced eye of an experienced educator. Most students met his gaze with the appropriate mixture of attention and slight intimidation. But when his eyes landed on the figure in the back row, something shifted in his expression. Recognition dawned slowly, like sunrise breaking through morning fog. The familiar jawline, the distinctive eyes, the way he held his pen, it all clicked into place. Professor Hawthorne's lips curved into what could charitably be called a smile, though it carried undertones that suggested anything but warmth. "Well, well," he said, his voice taking on a different quality that immediately caught the attention of every student in the room. "It seems we have a celebrity in our midst today." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and suddenly every head in the classroom turned toward the back row. Matt Damon, for it was indeed him, looked up from his notes with a mixture of resignation and quiet dignity. He had hoped to attend the lecture without drawing attention, to learn something new without the circus that often accompanied his public appearances, but he could see from the professor's expression that his peaceful academic morning was about to take a very different turn. "I didn't realize MIT had started offering chemistry courses for the entertainment industry," Professor Hawthorne continued, his voice dripping with condescension. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension that was rapidly building in the room. "Perhaps we should adjust our curriculum to be more accessible to those whose expertise lies in memorizing lines rather than understanding molecular structures." The classroom fell into an uncomfortable silence. Matt felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, smartphones discreetly emerging from pockets as students began to realize they were witnessing something that would likely end up on social media within the hour. He took a deep breath, his hand steady as he closed his journal and looked directly at the professor. "I apologize if my presence is disruptive, Professor," Matt said quietly, his voice carrying easily across the now silent lecture hall. "I'm genuinely interested in learning about chemistry, and I heard this was one of the best programs in the country. I didn't mean to cause any distraction." His words were respectful, humble even, but Professor Hawthorne seemed to interpret them as some sort of challenge to his authority. The professor's chest puffed out slightly, his posture becoming more rigid as he prepared to demonstrate exactly who was in charge of this classroom. "Oh, how thoughtful," Professor Hawthorne replied, his tone suggesting anything but gratitude. "And what, pray tell, sparked this sudden interest in the molecular sciences? Are you preparing for a role as a brilliant scientist? Perhaps Hollywood finally decided that actual knowledge might improve their laughably inaccurate portrayals of scientific research?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the classroom, though most students seemed more uncomfortable than amused. Matt's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained calm and measured when he responded. "Actually, I'm here because I've always been fascinated by how things work at the most fundamental level. Chemistry seems to explain so much about the world around us, from the way our bodies process food to how new materials are developed. I thought sitting in on a lecture might help me understand some of the basics." Professor Hawthorne let out a bark of laughter that echoed off the classroom walls. "The basics. How refreshing. Well then, Mr. Damon, since you're so eager to learn the basics, perhaps you'd like to participate in today's discussion?" He turned back to the whiteboard, where he had drawn a particularly complex molecular structure. "Can you tell us what this compound might be?" Matt studied the structure carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. The molecule on the board was indeed complex, a multi-ring system with various functional groups that would challenge even advanced undergraduate students. After a moment, he raised his hand tentatively. "I'm not entirely certain," he admitted honestly, "but based on the ring structure and the functional groups, it looks like it might be related to a steroid backbone, perhaps something similar to cholesterol or one of its derivatives." The answer was actually quite good for someone claiming to know only the basics, and several students looked impressed despite themselves. But Professor Hawthorne seized on the uncertainty in Matt's response like a predator sensing weakness. "Related to a steroid backbone," he repeated mockingly. "My dear Mr. Damon, this is Coruscant, one of the most important stress hormones in the human body. Surely someone is concerned with how things work at the most fundamental level would recognize such a basic biological molecule. The professor's voice grew louder, more theatrical, as he sensed his audience becoming more engaged. This is precisely what I mean about Hollywood's relationship with science, all surface, no substance. You see a few rings and immediately think steroid without understanding the intricate differences that make each molecule unique and functionally distinct. The energy in the classroom began to shift as Professor Hawthorne's performance continued. What had started as uncomfortable silence was gradually giving way to something else, a mixture of secondhand embarrassment and cruel entertainment that often emerges when people witness someone being publicly humiliated. Several students began to smirk, their phones now openly recording the interaction. The situation was taking on the quality of a viral video in the making, complete with a clear villain and victim. Comments were already being typed on social media. Professor destroys Hollywood actor with facts and logic. And Matt Damon gets schooled in chemistry class. You know what? Professor Hawthorne said, warming to his theme. Since you're so interested in learning, why don't we give you a real education? Class, can anyone explain to our celebrity guest the difference between cortisol and cortisone? Surely this should be elementary for someone claiming to understand how things work at the most fundamental level. Hands shot up around the room, students eager to demonstrate their knowledge in front of both their professor and an unexpected famous audience. The atmosphere had become competitive, almost gladiatorial, with Matt Damon as the unwilling entertainment. A young woman in the third row was called upon. Cortisol is the active hormone, she began confidently, while cortisone is the inactive precursor that gets converted to cortisol by the enzyme 11B hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 1. She glanced at Matt with a mixture of sympathy and superiority. Excellent, Sarah, Professor Hawthorne beamed. You see, Mr. Damon, this is what actual education looks like. It's not about memorizing lines or looking good on camera. It's about understanding complex systems, intricate relationships, and the precise mechanisms that govern life itself. Matt nodded politely, though those sitting closest to him could see his hands clenched slightly in his lap. He was clearly uncomfortable, but there was something else in his expression, a quality of patience that suggested he was enduring this treatment for reasons that weren't immediately apparent. Perhaps, the professor continued, we should stick to topics more suited to your background. Can anyone think of a chemistry concept that might be more appropriate for someone from the entertainment industry? The question was clearly rhetorical, designed to generate more laughter at Matt's expense. A student near the front called out, maybe something about the chemistry of popcorn? The comment triggered a wave of laughter that filled the lecture hall. Another voice added, or the molecular structure of fake movie Snow. More laughter followed, each comment emboldening the next. Professor Hawthorne allowed the mockery to continue for several moments before raising his hand for quiet. Now, class. We shouldn't be too harsh. After all, Mr. Damon has probably learned quite a bit about chemistry from his movie roles. Tell us, which of your films required the most extensive chemical research? The Martian, perhaps? Though I suspect the screenwriters did most of the heavy lifting there. Matt Damon sat in the growing maelstrom of ridicule with an almost supernatural calm that began to unsettle some of the more observant students in the classroom. While laughter continued to ripple through the rows of seats, a few individuals noticed something peculiar about his demeanor. This wasn't the defeated posture of someone being humiliated. It was the quiet composure of someone exercising tremendous restraint. His notebook remained open in front of him, and those who could see it from nearby seats noticed that his notes weren't the desperate scribbles of someone trying to keep up. Instead, they appeared to be detailed, methodical observations, written in neat handwriting that suggested familiarity with technical terminology. Occasionally, he would write something, pause thoughtfully, and then add what looked like corrections or additional insights. Professor Hawthorne, meanwhile, was thoroughly enjoying his performance. He had clearly decided that this unexpected opportunity to demonstrate his intellectual superiority over a Hollywood celebrity was too good to pass up. The classroom had become his stage, and he was playing to his audience with the enthusiasm of someone who rarely got to be the center of attention outside academic circles. You know, the professor continued, pacing back and forth in front of the whiteboard like a predator circling its prey. This actually presents us with a perfect teachable moment about the importance of intellectual humility. Science isn't about fame or fortune, it's about rigorous study, careful observation, and years of dedicated learning. He gestured broadly toward Matt, who remained seated quietly in the back row. What we have here is a perfect example of the Dunning-Kruger effect, the tendency for people with limited knowledge in a domain to overestimate their own competence in that domain. It's quite common, actually, particularly among celebrities who become accustomed to being treated as experts in fields far outside their actual expertise. The term Dunning-Kruger effect seemed to resonate with the students, many of whom nodded knowingly. They had encountered this concept in their psychology courses, and applying it to the situation at hand felt both intellectually satisfying and socially entertaining. Matt's pen moved across his notebook page, but instead of looking defeated or angry, he appeared to be taking notes on the professor's lecture itself. Several students found this behavior puzzling. Why would someone being publicly humiliated continue to engage with the material so seriously? Professor Hawthorne continued, clearly enjoying his monologue. Is that this kind of intellectual tourism actually undermines the serious work being done by real scientists. When celebrities dabble in complex fields without proper training, they can spread misinformation or create false impressions about what scientific understanding actually requires. The lecture had been going on for nearly 45 minutes, with Professor Hawthorne alternating between genuine chemistry instruction and pointed commentary about intellectual authenticity. The students had settled into a rhythm of note-taking, punctuated by occasional glances toward the back row, where Matt Damon continued his patient endurance of the ongoing critique. Then, as Professor Hawthorne launched into a particularly complex explanation of enzyme kinetics, something shifted. He was drawing reaction mechanisms on the whiteboard, explaining the role of cofactors in metabolic pathways, when he made a statement that caused Matt to look up sharply from his notebook. The beauty of enzyme catalysis, the professor declared, lies in the precise positioning of amino acid residues that lower the activation energy through transition state stabilization. It's these kinds of sophisticated concepts that separate real scientific understanding from Hollywood's simplified portrayals of how biology actually works. Matt's hand went up. The movement was so unexpected that it took several seconds for Professor Hawthorne to notice it. When he did, his expression showed a mixture of surprise and irritation, as if he couldn't believe his demonstration subject was attempting to participate again. "Yes, Mr. Damon," he said with exaggerated patience. "Do you have another question about the basics?" Matt stood up slowly, his notebook in hand. The classroom fell absolutely silent. Not the uncomfortable quiet of earlier, but a complete absence of sound that seemed to compress the air itself. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried a quality that immediately commanded attention. "Professor Hawthorne, I appreciate the thoroughness of your explanation, but I'm curious about something specific." He paused, consulting his notebook briefly. "When you mentioned transition state stabilization, you referenced the general principle, but I wondered if you could elaborate on how this applies specifically to the mechanism proposed by Linus Pauling in his 1946 paper on the nature of forces between large molecules of biological interest." The question hung in the air like a precisely thrown dart. Professor Hawthorne's confident expression flickered slightly, and several students exchanged glances. The question was highly specific, referencing work that wasn't part of their current curriculum. Further, Matt continued, his voice gaining strength. "If we're considering Pauling's transition state theory in the context of modern enzyme design, how would you reconcile his original model with the more recent work on computational enzyme design, particularly the studies published in Nature by David Baker's team at the University of Washington?" The classroom was now dead silent. Professor Hawthorne opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The question wasn't just sophisticated, it was cutting edge, referencing work that was at the forefront of current research. Matt wasn't finished. "I asked because during my preparation for a recent film project, I spent considerable time working with biochemists at both MIT and Caltech, and there seemed to be some interesting disagreements about the practical applications of these theoretical frameworks." The The silence that followed Matt's question was unlike anything the classroom had experienced. It wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of social awkwardness or the expectant hush before a professor's response. It was the profound silence of a room full of people suddenly realizing that their understanding of the situation had been completely wrong. Professor Hawthorne's face had gone through several color changes, from his usual confident pink to a pale white, and now to a slightly flushed red as he struggled to formulate a response. The question Matt had posed wasn't just sophisticated, it was the kind of inquiry that would challenge even senior faculty members specializing in biochemistry. Well, the professor began, then stopped. He turned toward the whiteboard as if looking for inspiration, but the molecular structures he had drawn earlier now seemed to mock his uncertainty. The work you're referencing is quite specialized. Yes, it is, Matt agreed quietly, which is why I was hoping you might be able to explain how it relates to your earlier point about transition state stabilization. You see, when I was working with Dr. Sarah Chen at MIT's Koch Institute, she mentioned that the traditional understanding of enzyme catalysis was being challenged by some recent computational studies. Several students gasped audibly at the mention of Dr. Chen, who was a renowned figure in biochemical engineering. The idea that Matt Damon had been working with her seemed impossible, yet his familiarity with the specifics suggested something more than casual conversation. Matt opened his notebook and read from it directly. According to the 2023 study published in Cell, the energy landscape theory suggests that enzyme efficiency might be less about transition state stabilization and more about conformational sampling. I was wondering if you had thoughts on how this might impact drug design strategies, particularly for neurological disorders. The professor's mouth opened and closed without sound. Around the classroom, students were frantically typing on their phones, trying to look up the references Matt was citing. Those who found them quickly realized that not only were these real studies, but they were recent, groundbreaking work that few people outside specialized research circles would know about. The reason I ask, Matt continued, his voice growing more confident, is that the film I mentioned, it's not just entertainment. We're working with the Michael J. Fox Foundation to create an accurate portrayal of Parkinson's research, and I've been embedded with research teams for the past 18 months, learning not just about the disease, but about the cutting-edge science being used to combat it. The revelation hit the classroom like a physical wave. This wasn't a celebrity playing at being smart. This was someone who had dedicated serious time and effort to understanding complex scientific concepts for a purpose that went far beyond mere entertainment. Professor Hawthorne had recovered enough to attempt a response, but it was clear that Matt's questions had pushed him far outside his comfort zone. Well, the computational approaches you're mentioning are indeed interesting, but they're quite removed from the fundamental principles we focus on in this course. Of course, Matt replied diplomatically. But I think the fundamental principles become more interesting when we see how they're being applied in current research, don't you? He consulted his notebook again. For instance, the work being done on directed evolution of enzymes, Francis Arnold's Nobel Prize-winning techniques. They seem to challenge some traditional assumptions about how we understand protein function. At the mention of Francis Arnold's Nobel Prize work, several students looked genuinely impressed. This wasn't Hollywood trivia or surface-level name-dropping. This was detailed knowledge of current scientific developments, Matt continued. I had the opportunity to visit Arnold's lab at Caltech last month, and what struck me was how her approach to engineering new enzymes bypasses some of the theoretical frameworks that have dominated the field for decades. Instead of trying to predict optimal structures, her team essentially lets evolution do the work. Through iterative selection processes. He paused, looking around the classroom with the same humble expression he had worn earlier, but now it carried a different weight. I found it fascinating because it suggests that our understanding of enzyme catalysis might be less complete than we sometimes assume. Rather than relying solely on transition state theory, we might need to embrace more empirical approaches. Professor Hawthorne was now clearly out of his depth. The concepts Matt was discussing weren't just advanced, they represented cutting-edge research that wasn't covered in standard textbooks or undergraduate curricula. Those are certainly interesting developments, he managed weakly. What really amazed me, Matt went on, was learning about the connection between enzyme design and drug discovery. When I was working with researchers at the Broad Institute, they showed me how computational protein design is being used to create entirely new therapeutic approaches for neurodegenerative diseases. He closed his notebook and looked directly at Professor Hawthorne. I suppose what I'm trying to understand is how these modern developments relate to the classical mechanisms you were explaining earlier. Are we looking at a fundamental shift in how we approach biochemistry, or are these new techniques simply extensions of established principles? The question was clearly beyond what Professor Hawthorne was prepared to discuss. Around the classroom, students were now looking at Matt with expressions ranging from amazement to embarrassment about their earlier laughter. The transformation in the classroom atmosphere was palpable. What had begun as a public humiliation had evolved into something entirely different, a demonstration of intellectual depth that few had anticipated. Students who had been laughing at Matt's expense minutes earlier were now hanging on his every word, realizing they were witnessing someone who had pursued scientific knowledge with the same dedication he brought to his acting craft. Sarah, the student who had earlier answered the question about cortisol and cortisone, raised her hand tentatively. "Mr. Damon," she began, her voice respectful, "could you explain more about what you learned at the Broad Institute?" "That sounds incredible," Matt smiled, and for the first time since entering the classroom, it was a completely genuine expression. "Well, I should clarify that I'm not a scientist myself. I'm an actor who was fortunate enough to work with real experts, who were incredibly generous with their time and knowledge." His humility was striking, particularly in contrast to the arrogance that had filled the room earlier. "The Broad Institute project started because we wanted to make sure our film portrayed neurological research accurately. Too many movies get the science completely wrong, and when you're dealing with diseases that affect millions of families, accuracy becomes a moral responsibility." He opened his notebook again, but this time it was to share rather than defend. "Dr. Chen and her team at MIT taught me that modern biochemistry is incredibly interdisciplinary. You need chemistry, yes, but also physics, computer science, and even engineering. The tools they use to study protein folding, for instance, involve quantum mechanical calculations that require supercomputers." Professor Hawthorne had remained silent during this exchange, his earlier bravado completely deflated. Several students noticed his discomfort and began to feel embarrassed for their professor rather than entertained by his performance. Matt turned toward the whiteboard where the cortisol structure was still drawn. "Actually, Professor, your earlier example of cortisol is perfect for illustrating something I learned about drug design. The research team showed me how tiny modifications to steroid structures can completely change their biological activity. It's not just about recognizing the molecule, it's about understanding how structure relates to function at an incredibly precise level." He approached the board and, with Professor Hawthorne's implicit permission, began drawing. "For instance, if you modify cortisol at this position," he said, indicating a specific carbon on the structure, "you can create compounds that retain anti-ammonute properties while reducing side effects. The challenge is predicting which modifications will work without extensive testing." The students watched in fascination as Matt demonstrated a clear understanding of structure-activity relationships in medicinal chemistry. This wasn't memorized information, it was integrated knowledge that showed genuine comprehension of complex principles. As the official class time drew to a close, Professor Hawthorne stood at the front of the room, looking like a man who had learned an unexpectedly humbling lesson. The classroom dynamic had completely reversed. Instead of a professor educating a celebrity, they had witnessed a masterclass in intellectual humility and the value of genuine curiosity. Matt began packing his notebook, but several students approached him with questions. Rather than basking in his newfound respect, he answered each inquiry thoughtfully while consistently directing credit to the research teams he had worked with. "The most important thing I learned," he told a group of students, "is that real expertise takes years to develop, and even then, the best scientists are constantly questioning their assumptions. The researchers I worked with weren't impressive because they knew everything. They were impressive because they knew how much they didn't know." Professor Hawthorne finally found his voice again. "Mr. Damon," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your presence here that were unfair and unprofessional. Matt turned toward the professor with the same respectful expression he had maintained throughout the ordeal. Professor, you don't need to apologize. I understand why my being here seems strange. I probably should have introduced myself and explained my background at the beginning. The grace with which he handled the professor's apology was perhaps more impressive than his scientific knowledge. Besides, he added with a slight smile, I did learn quite a bit from your lecture. Your explanation of enzyme kinetics was clearer than some of the research papers I've struggled through. Several students laughed, but it was warm laughter now, appreciative rather than mocking. The tension that had filled the room for most of the period had dissipated, replaced by mutual respect and genuine intellectual curiosity. As students began filing out of the classroom, many stopped to shake Matt's hand or ask for his thoughts on pursuing careers that bridged science and communication. He spoke with each person individually, offering encouragement and sharing contacts when appropriate. Professor Hawthorne remained behind, straightening his papers with obvious embarrassment. Matt approached him as the last students left. Professor, I hope my presence didn't disrupt your curriculum too much. Your students are impressive. They asked really thoughtful questions. Thank you, the professor replied, his voice much quieter than it had been earlier. I think perhaps I needed a reminder about the importance of intellectual humility myself. Matt extended his hand, which the professor shook gratefully. We all do, Matt replied. That's what makes science so exciting. There's always more to learn. As Matt left the classroom, he carried with him not just the satisfaction of having handled a difficult situation with grace, but the renewed appreciation for the incredible complexity and beauty of scientific discovery. Behind him, he left a classroom full of students who had learned something far more valuable than enzyme kinetics. They had learned about the danger of making assumptions, the power of intellectual humility, and the remarkable things that can happen when curiosity triumphs over ego. Professor Hawthorne stood alone in his empty classroom, looking at the molecular structures still drawn on his whiteboard. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning not what he knew, but how much he still had to learn. It was, perhaps, the most important lesson he had received in decades. And that, my friends, is how a simple misunderstanding in a chemistry classroom became a powerful reminder that wisdom and knowledge can come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the people we're quickest to judge are the ones who have the most to teach us. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey of learning, humility, and human connection. If this story touched your heart or made you think differently about judging others, please share it with someone who might need to hear this message. Remember, every person you meet knows something you don't, and that's what makes life so beautifully unpredictable. Until our next story together, keep your mind open, your heart humble, and never stop learning. The world is full of surprises waiting to inspire us all.